The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Hotel shimmered like a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the polished marble floor. The air smelled of expensive perfume, fine wine, and the subtle, clean scent of money. It was the annual gala for the city's most exclusive arts foundation. A night where culture was both celebrated and used as a quiet weapon in the endless game of social standing. In the center of this world, by the gleaming black grand piano, stood a man who felt he belonged there completely. He was known simply as Anton to this crowd, though his full name was longer and more decorated, much like his playing. A concert pianist celebrated in reviews for his flawless technique and steely precision. He was tall, with sharp features and hair swept back like a composer from another century. His suit was impeccably tailored, dark, and severe. He held a glass of champagne not as a drink, but as a prop, barely sipping from it. His eyes, a cool gray, scanned the room, not seeing people, but assessing an audience. He had already performed. He'd chosen a ferociously difficult piece by Liszt, a whirlwind of notes meant to stun and impress. His fingers had flown across the keys like machine guards, every accent sharp, every crescendo calculated. The applause that followed was vigorous, respectful, and to Anton it felt like his due. A tribute to the discipline he had mastered. Now, in the softer buzz of conversation after his performance, he held court. A small circle of admirers, patrons, fellow musicians, socialites listened as he dissected the shortcomings of modern music education. His voice was calm, assured, each word chosen to reinforce his place at the pinnacle. "The instrument," he said, gesturing gracefully toward the piano with his glass, "is not a toy. It is a temple, and too many approach it with dirty hands, with no understanding of the history, the theory, the sacrifice required to truly speak its language." Nods of agreement rippled through his circle. A woman in a silver gown sighed, "To hear you play, Anton, is to understand that language perfectly." He offered a thin, practiced smile. This was the ecosystem he thrived in. Admiration feeding his certainty demanding more admiration. It was then, from the corner of his eye, that he noticed a disruption. A woman had approached the piano from the side service entrance, the one used by the waiting staff. She was out of place. While every other woman in the room seemed wrapped in silk or velvet, she wore a simple, long dress of a faded blue linen, clean but plain. Her hair, a warm brown streaked with hints of gray, was tied back in a no-nonsense braid. She wasn't old, but she wasn't young either. Her face had a quiet kind of strength, with fine lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled at real things, not just polite conversation. She wasn't looking at the crowd or seeking champagne. She was looking at the piano, not with the awe of a fan, but with a deep, familiar curiosity, as if greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in a long time. She reached out a hand and, without touching the keys, let her fingers hover just above them, tracing the shape of the fallboard. Anton's lip twitched. Who was this? Hotel staff, perhaps? A cleaner who'd wandered in. Her hands, he noted with a flicker of disdain, were not the pale, carefully maintained hands of a pianist. They were capable-looking hands, with short, clean nails and a faint tracery of what might have been old scars or calluses. To him, in that moment, they looked like the hands of someone who worked with soil or wood, not Sonoda's. She must have felt his gaze, for she looked up. Her eyes met his across the curve of the piano. They were a clear, calm green, and they held none of the deference he was used to. She simply offered a small, genuine smile and made a soft comment, more to herself than to anyone. But the room had grown quiet enough for it to be heard. "What a beautiful old voice it must have," she said, her voice low and melodic. "You can hear it even in the silence, like a bell that's just finished ringing." A titter went through Anton's circle. The comment was poetic, unschooled. It was the kind of thing a sentimental amateur would say. Anton saw an opportunity. Here was a living example of what he had just been criticizing, someone who saw the piano as a beautiful object, not a rigorous discipline. A chance to demonstrate, publicly, the gulf between true understanding and simple appreciation. He took a few steps toward her, his shoes clicking on the floor. The crowd parted for him. He infused his voice with a tone of patient, condescending amusement. "It's a Bissendorfer," he announced, as if introducing a royal personage, one of the finest in the city. "Its voice, as you call it, isn't in the silence. It's in the control, the touch of a trained artist. It responds to precision, not poetry." The woman, Elara, didn't flinch. She simply nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "I'm sure it does," she said. "But sometimes an instrument has stories it wants to tell, too. Not just the ones we force upon it." This was too much. A socialite standing near Anton, a man who loved drama almost as much as art, chuckled. "Perhaps you should give us a demonstration of these stories, my dear. Let's have a little duel. Anton, you've met your match." Laughter, light and brittle, filled the space around them. Anton's cool composure hardened into something sharper. A duel? With her? The idea was absurd, ridiculous. Yet he saw the eager faces of the crowd. They wanted a spectacle, a harmless joke at the simple woman's expense. And he could provide it, while beautifully underscoring his own superiority. He let a wide, theatrical smile spread across his face. He placed his champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray and spread his hands, addressing the whole room now. A duel. Why not? An object lesson in the art of the piano. He turned his gaze fully on Elara. The challenge was no longer playful. It was a public test, a setting of a trap. "Shall we? You seem to hear such music in its soul. Show us what you're." Simple ears perceive in its tone. He gestured magnanimously toward the piano bench. The spotlight of attention, hot and uncomfortable, was now fixed entirely on the woman in the blue dress. The room fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Everyone watched her. Would she run? Would she stammer and refuse, proving his point about the cowardice of the unqualified? For a long moment, Elara just looked at the piano. She looked at Anton's smug, expectant face. She looked at the crowd, a sea of sequins and judgment. A faint pink flush colored her cheeks, but it was not the flush of sheer humiliation he hoped for. It was the flush of someone being pushed into a spotlight they never wanted. She took a slow, deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. Then she lifted her clear green eyes and gave a single quiet nod. "All right," she said, her voice still soft, but now carrying to the edges of the silent room. "I will play." Anton's smile didn't waver, but inside he felt a spike of triumph. The game was on. He leaned casually against the side of the piano, crossing his arms, preparing to be a gracious, critical victor. He had set the stage perfectly. Now he would watch her falter. The first part of his victory was complete. The quiet word, "all right," hung in the air, somehow louder than the chatter that had come before it. For a second, nobody moved. They had expected a refusal, tears, a flustered exit. They had not expected quiet acceptance. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd. The socialite who had suggested the duel clapped his hands together once, a sharp, delighted sound. "Bravo! A sport!" Anton, still leaning against the piano, gave a slow, approving nod, as if a student had finally agreed to take a difficult exam. Inside, he was pleased. His script was being followed. She would sit, play something childish or clumsy, and he would then, with great showmanship, explain why it was lacking. He might even play the same piece after her, to demonstrate the correct way. It would be a perfect, gentle humiliation, a reminder to everyone of the natural order of things. But the woman, Elara, did not immediately move to the bench. She just stood there, looking at the instrument. The initial flush on her cheeks had faded, replaced by a pale, serious calm. Her eyes were fixed on the black and white keys. But she seemed to be seeing something far away. "I must say," she began, her voice still that low, melodic thread. But now it carried a new weight in the quiet room. "I haven't played for an audience in a very long time. Not an audience like this." She gestured slightly, a small movement of her work-worn hand, taking in the chandeliers, the silk gowns, the watching eyes. "Nonsense," Anton said, his voice smooth as oil. He pushed off from the piano and took a step closer, playing to the crowd. "Music is music. An audience is an audience. The piano doesn't know the difference between a drawing room and a ballroom." He meant it as a lofty, generous statement, but it came out sounding hollow, as if he'd read it in a book of quotations. Elara's eyes flicked to his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker in them, not fear, but something like pity. It unnerved him. "The piano might not," she said, "but the music does, my music. It isn't really for galas." A wave of soft laughter moved through the guests. They thought she was making excuses. They heard the word gala in her simple dress and assumed she felt out of her depth, which, of course, she was. Anton seized on it, all the more reason to share it. He declared, spreading his arms wide. He was the gracious master now, encouraging the shy novice. "We are here for art, are we not? True art isn't made only for concert halls. Come, you have challenged the instrument's spirit. Now let us hear it speak." He had cleverly twisted it. Now it was as if she had thrown down the gauntlet with her comment about the piano's old voice. He had made himself the responder, the defender of high art. The crowd ate it up. A few people began a soft, rhythmic clap. "Play, play, play." Elara closed her eyes for a second. She took another one of those deep, slow breaths. When she opened them, the distant look was gone, replaced by a focused resolve. The gentle curiosity had hardened into something steely. She nodded again, not at Anton, not at the crowd, but as if agreeing to something with herself. "Okay," she said, simply. She walked toward the piano bench. But she didn't walk like Anton had earlier, with a performer's proud stride. She walked with a kind of reverence, each step measured. She didn't swoop onto the bench. She stopped in front of it, placed a hand on its polished wood, and then sat down, smoothing her simple blue dress underneath her. The crowd pressed in closer, forming a tight half-circle around the piano. Anton remained in his prime spot, leaning again, his arms crossed over his chest. A faint, condescending smile was fixed on his lips. He was already composing his gentle, correcting remarks in his head. Asterisk a valiant effort, but you see, the tempo was inconsistent. Or asterisk a sweet melody, but one must consider the harmonic structure. Asterisk Elara didn't look at the keys. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They were not positioned in the perfect, curved, ball-holding shape Anton taught his students. They lay relaxed, palms down, fingers slightly curled. They were honest hands. He could see now that the marks were indeed calluses, but not from a hoe or a saw. They were in peculiar places pads on the tips of her fingers, a faint line across the base of her thumb. The hands of someone who used them, intensely, but not from manual labor in the way he'd imagined. She lifted them and placed them on the keys, not with a dramatic flourish, but as if laying them on the shoulders of a dear friend. She adjusted the bench slightly, not for show, but for a comfort only she could feel. The room was so silent, now that the soft scrape of the bench legs on the floor was clearly heard. Anton waited for her to begin some simple, stumbling scale or the first few bars of a well-known beginner's piece. He prepared his face to look politely interested. Alira's shoulders dropped. All the tension seemed to leave her body. She was no longer the woman being stared at by 100 eyes. She was alone with the piano. Her head bowed slightly, her gaze turned inward. For a long 5-second eternity, there was only the sound of the ballroom's hidden air system and the faint rustle of fabric. Then she began. It was not a scale. It was not a famous sonata dot. It was a single deep note from the lower register, played not loudly, but with a firm, resonant touch. The sound bloomed in the silent room, warm and round, like a stone dropped into a dark pond. Before it faded, her right hand came in, not with a melody, but with a cluster of notes, a chord. But it wasn't a standard chord from a textbook. It was something ancient-sounding, slightly strange, and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was a sound that seemed to contain both a question and a sigh. Anton's polite smile froze on his face. Her left hand began a slow, walking pattern, not a flashy bass line, but a solid, grounding rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Over the top of it, her right hand started to weave a melody. It was folk-like, simple in its core, a tune you felt you might have heard long ago in a different life. It was the kind of melody that spoke of hills and rivers, of hard work and quiet evenings. But then, something happened. She repeated the melody, and this time she decorated it. A flickering run of notes here, an unexpected harmony there. It wasn't showy. It was playful, like a stream finding new paths around old rocks. The simplicity of the tune began to transform. It gained depth, emotion, layers. Anton uncrossed his arms. He stood up straight. The condescending thoughts in his head evaporated, replaced by a single, sharp, professional recognition. Her technique. It was flawless. Not flawless in his way, not like a polished, gleaming machine. It was flawless in a completely different way. It was effortless, organic. Her fingers, with their calluses, moved with an agility and a strength that was astonishing. They flew over octaves with no visible strain, created rippling arpeggios that sounded like water, not exercises. The dynamic control was masterful. The music swelled and faded like a natural breath. Not because a sheet of paper told it to, but because the story she was telling demanded it. She wasn't just playing notes. She was speaking. The piano was no longer a Bissendorfer in a hotel ballroom. Under her hands, it became a field under a wide sky, a kitchen warm with firelight, a heart holding a lifetime of joy and sorrow. The simple woman was gone. In her place was a musician, a true one, of a kind Anton had only read about and never truly believed existed. The smugness drained from his body, leaving behind a cold, hollow feeling. He wasn't listening as a judge anymore. He was listening as a student. And he was hearing, for the first time in his life, what music could actually be. The single resonant note that began her playing had done more than break the silence. It had broken the expectation in the room. That first folk melody, so simple and earthy, had been a trick, a seed. Now, everyone watched as that seed cracked open and began to grow into something astonishing. Elara's body moved with the music, but not in the dramatic, theatrical way Anton used. There was no tossing of the head or fierce grimace. Her movements were small, economical. A slight lean into a deep chord, a gentle sway as her hands crossed over one another. It was as if the music was moving through her, and her body was just following its current. Her face, lit by the soft glow of the piano light, was a map of quiet concentration and deep feeling. Sometimes her eyes were closed. Sometimes they were fixed on some point in the distance far beyond the velvet-draped walls. The simple tune began to change. It was like watching a master storyteller take a well-known tale and tell it in a way you'd never heard before. She played the melody once, pure and clean. Then she began to improvise. Her right hand spun delicate, lace-like variations around the core notes, each twist surprising, yet feeling perfectly right. Her left hand abandoned its steady heartbeat and began a conversation, answering the melody with bass notes that were deep and thoughtful, sometimes playful, sometimes mournful. She wasn't just decorating the tune. She was exploring every shadow and highlight hidden inside it. Anton's body, which had been posed in cool critique, was now rigid. The last trace of his smile was gone, wiped away as if by a cloth. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his fingers unconsciously twitching, mirroring the shapes her hands made on the keys. He was a pianist, a technician of the highest order, and he could see what no one else in the room fully understood: the sheer, staggering skill required to do what she was doing. This wasn't learned from sheet music. This was music being born in the moment. Her knowledge of harmony wasn't academic. It was instinctive, vast, and fearless. She would land on a chord that made his theoretical mind wince for a split second a clash that shouldn't work, and then, with a grace that took his breath away, she would resolve it into something so beautiful it made his heart ache. She was painting with sound, using colors he didn't even have names for. The room was utterly captive. The socialites who had come for champagne and gossip stood frozen. The waitstaff had paused in the shadows, trays forgotten. The only sound was the piano, which no longer sounded like a concert instrument, but like a living voice. It sang, it laughed, it whispered secrets. Under her hands, it became a storm on a wide plain, then the gentle rain after. It became the joyful chaos of a village dance, then a single, lonely voice singing in the dark. Anton felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His own performance, the technically perfect list, now played in his memory like a child's recital. It was all notes and no soul. A brilliant, empty shell. He had spent his life building a beautiful, intricate cage of technique, and he lived inside it, proud of the bars. This woman, she wasn't in a cage. She was flying. She used a technique that was every bit as formidable as his own. But she wore it like a comfortable old coat, invisible. Because for her, it was only a tool to get to the music, not the destination itself. He looked at her hands again. The calluses. He understood them now. They were not from manual labor. They were from this. From hours that turned into days, from a lifetime of communion with the keyboard, not in a sterile practice room, but in places where music was a part of living. The faint scar on her thumb, perhaps, from tuning an old piano herself. The strength in her wrists, the independence of her fingers. This was the physique of a true craftsman, a musician who had married her body to the instrument through sheer, loving use. A feeling began to rise in Anton's chest, cold and heavy. It was shame, but it was more than that. It was the terrifying collapse of a world he had believed in. He had built his entire identity on being better, more disciplined, more precise, more talented. He looked down on those who weren't. He saw this woman in her simple dress and saw a category: amateur, outsider, lesser. He was wrong. He was completely, utterly wrong. She was the real thing. And he, with all his prizes and his tailored suit and his condescending smiles, was the imitation. The music swelled. Alara was building towards something. The folk tune had been completely transformed, woven into a tapestry of sound that was both complex and deeply emotional. She used the entire range of the piano. The low notes thrummed like distant thunder. The high notes sparkled like stars revealed after the storm. And through it all was that singing, human melody, now carrying the weight of everything she had built around it. Anton couldn't breathe. He was not just hearing music. He was witnessing a soul speaking without words. He heard joy that had known sorrow. He heard peace that had been wrestled from hardship. He heard a love for the world in all its rough and smooth edges. His own music spoke only of Anton, his control, his ambition. Her music spoke of life itself. In that moment, the duel was over. It had been over since the first chord. There was no contest. He had challenged her to a battle of technical skill, and she had responded by revealing an entire universe he didn't know existed. The victory was not even the point anymore. The victory was a petty, childish idea. He had wanted to teach her a lesson about the temple of the piano. Instead, she was showing him that the temple wasn't made of marble rules and gold-leafed theory. It was made of the wood of old trees, the breath of the player, and the heartbeat of anyone willing to listen. She was playing, and he was, for the first time in his adult life, truly listening. He forgot the crowd. He forgot his own humiliation. He was just a man standing by a piano, being rebuilt note by note. The cold, certain part of him that had ruled his life for so long was cracking apart, and through the cracks poured this unbelievable, undeniable sound. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard, and it was also the most painful, because it showed him with perfect clarity exactly what he lacked. Not skill, but heart. The music didn't just fill the room. It changed the air. The glittering, perfumed atmosphere of the gala was gone. In its place was something raw and real. Ilara's playing had built a world inside the ballroom, a world of feelings so vivid that the crystal chandeliers seemed to fade into shadows. People weren't just hearing a performance. They were feeling a story they didn't know the words to, a story that tugged at memories they'd forgotten they had. Her hands were a blur of motion, but it was a purposeful, graceful blur. The simple melody from the beginning was now a mighty river, fed by 1,000 strains of harmony and rhythm. She wove in threads of other styles a hint of blues that made the soul ache, a flash of complex jazz chords that sparked like lightning, a rhythmic drive that felt like a train moving through a dark night. It was all one piece, all flowing from that first humble folk tune. She was showing them where music comes from the dirt and the sky and the human heart, and how it can grow into something magnificent. Anton stood as still as one of the marble columns. The cold, heavy feeling in his chest had liquefied into a kind of awful, dawning warmth. It was the heat of pure, unadorned shame, but mixed with it was a wonder so profound it hurt. He watched her, no longer as a critic, but as a student who has just realized his teacher is a master. He saw the economy of her movement, the way no motion was wasted. A tiny adjustment of her wrist produced a cascade of pearly notes. A shift of her weight brought out a thunderous depth from the bass. This was a physical knowledge of the instrument that went beyond practice. It was intimacy. His mind, usually so quick to analyze and categorize, was silent. The internal voice that always commented, "The tempo here is rushed, the phrasing could be more lyrical," was gone. It had been stunned into silence. There was no could be. There only was. This was the music, whole and complete, and it was perfect. He thought of his own hands. They were insured. He had them massaged and cared for like precious objects. They were tools for achieving a specific, polished result. He looked at her hands, dancing over the keys. They were also tools, but they were more than that. They were conduits. The calluses weren't a flaw. They were the metals of 1,000 honest conversations with the piano. The faint scars were the punctuation marks in a long story of love and work. Her hands spoke of life lived, of music not as a separate, exalted thing, but as part of the grain of daily existence. She had probably fixed things, gardened, held other hands, kneaded bread. And all of that was in the music. Now a strength that was gentle, a certainty that was kind. The piece was reaching its summit. The energy in the room was taut, like a wire about to sing. Ilara's body was coiled with a focused power. Her face which had been so serene, showed the strain of channeling something this big. But it was a good strain, the strain of a climber almost at the peak. She wasn't performing for them anymore. She was climbing this musical mountain for herself, and they were just breathless witnesses to the ascent. Anton's own life flashed before his eyes, not in a dramatic way, but in a series of cold, clear images. The lonely childhood in a practice room, his father's stopwatch ticking, the trophies on a shelf, their gold plating feeling cheap, the empty applause that sounded the same in every city, the careful, calculated programs designed to impress critics, the way he spoke to other musicians, always searching for the flaw, shoring up his own position, the woman in the silver gown sighing asterisk. To hear you play is to understand that language perfectly. He understood now that he had never understood the language at all. He had only learned the grammar. He could construct perfect, complicated sentences that meant nothing. Ilara was speaking in her mother tongue, and he was finally hearing it. A devastating clarity settled over him. This wasn't about winning or losing. That was the small, petty game of a small, petty man. This was about truth. The truth was that art wasn't a fortress you built to keep others out. It was a bridge you built to let others in. He had spent his life in the fortress, looking down from the battlements. She was on the bridge, welcoming everyone across. The music crested. For a few magnificent seconds, everything she had introduced, the folk tune, the bluesy sorrow, the jazzy complexity, the driving rhythm, came together in a triumphant, soaring convergence. It was joyful and sad, simple and complex, all at once. It was the sound of a life fully lived. Then, with a series of resolved, echoing chords that fell like soft stones into a still pond, she began her descent. The energy gently ebbed. The mighty river widened and slowed, becoming deep and calm. The melody returned, not in its original simple form, but transformed, wiser, carrying the weight of the entire journey. She played it softly, with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of more than one person in the crowd. The final notes were not loud. They were a whisper. A single high note, pure as water, held with the soft pedal down until it faded into nothing. Into that silence she had first spoken of the silence that held the echo of the bell. Her hands came to rest in her lap. She bowed her head, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep, quiet breath. She was back. The journey was over. For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing. No sound at all. The spell was so complete that no one dared break it. The audience was a collection of statues, their faces wet, their mouths slightly open. They had been taken somewhere, and they hadn't quite returned. Anton was the first to move. Not towards her, not to speak. He took a single stumbling step backwards, as if pushed by the force of the silence. The movement broke the collective trance. And then the sound came. It wasn't polite, measured applause. It was an explosion. A visceral, emotional roar of clapping, of shouts, of genuine, messy human feeling. People weren't just applauding. They were releasing the emotion she had poured into them. They stamped their feet. They called out wordless praises. The noise filled the grand ballroom, warmer and more real than any music the expensive acoustics had ever been designed for. Through it all, Ilara simply sat. She looked up, a little dazed, as if surprised to find herself there. Then she saw the faces, not judging, not amused, but open, grateful, even awestruck. A small, shy, almost embarrassed smile touched her lips. She gave a slight, humble nod of thanks. Her eyes found Anton's across the piano. He expected to see triumph there, gloating, the look of a victor surveying the defeated. He braced for it, knowing he deserved it, but it wasn't there. Her gaze held no victory. It held something else entirely, a kind of quiet recognition, a shared understanding. It was the look you might give a fellow traveler, after a long, hard road, a look that said, "You heard it too." In that glance, she offered him not humiliation, but a kind of forgiveness he didn't deserve and couldn't bear. He had to look away. The weight of it, the sheer generosity in her simple look, was heavier than any shame. He turned his face downward, staring at the polished wood of the floor, hearing the storm of applause wash over him, feeling more alone and more seen than he had ever felt in his life. The applause was a living thing. It crashed against the walls and the high ceiling, a wave of sound that went on and on. It wasn't stopping. People clapped until their hands stung, not out of duty, but because they needed to. They had to put the feeling somewhere, to give something back for the gift they just received. Alara stood from the piano bench. The movement was slow, as if she were waking from a deep sleep. She gave one more small, flustered nod to the room, her hand briefly touching the piano's lid, as if in thanks or farewell. Then she did something Anton did not expect. She didn't stay to soak in the adoration. She turned and began to make her way quietly, without a fuss, through the crowd, back toward the service entrance from which she had come. The crowd, seeing her move, tried to stop her. Hands reached out to gently touch her arm. Voices called praises and questions. "Who are you?" "That was incredible." "Please, play more." She only shook her head with that same shy, almost pained smile, murmuring soft "thank yous," and kept moving, a simple blue figure parting a sea of silk and sequins. She seemed to shrink from the spotlight, eager to return to the quiet shadows, from which she'd emerged. Her exit broke the spell for everyone but Anton, as the crowd, buzzing with a new, excited energy, began to chatter and gather into animated groups. He remained by the piano, an island of stillness in the moving room. The storm of applause faded into a distant roar in his ears. All he could hear was the echo of the last, pure note and the deafening silence of his own thoughts. He was cold. He felt a deep, physical chill, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of him. Slowly, he reached out and placed his palm flat on the smooth, black wood of the piano. It was still warm. A subtle, vibrating warmth hummed under his hand, the instrument's strings still whispering with the memory of her touch. He closed his eyes. He could almost see the ghosts of her fingers on the keys. The images of the evening played behind his eyelids. His own crisp, empty performance. His smug smile. The way he had looked at her calloused hands and seen something lesser. The theatrical sweep of his arm as he issued the challenge. Each memory was a small, sharp knife. He had been so sure, so utterly, completely sure of his place in the world. He had built a palace of his own talent and had lived inside it, believing it was the only palace that mattered. She had walked in, not to destroy it, but to show him it had no windows. And through the walls she opened, he had seen a whole sky he never knew was there. A man clapped him on the shoulder, jolting him back. It was the socialite who had started it all, his face flushed with wine and excitement. "Anton, what a show!" "Who was that?" "You certainly brought out a hidden talent tonight." "I?" "Quite the spectacle." The man meant no harm. He was just chattering in the way of such parties, already turning the profound into gossip. But the words felt like poison. You brought out a hidden talent. As if Anton had been a clever curator, showcasing an amusing oddity. As if this had been his plan all along, Anton removed the man's hand from his shoulder, not roughly, but with a firm, cold finality. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just looked at the man, and whatever the man saw in Anton's gray eyes, the shattered pride, the raw shame made his smile falter. He muttered something and melted back into the crowd. Anton was alone again. He looked at the empty bench. He thought about sitting on it, about trying to play something, anything, to cover the scent of her music that still hung in the air. But he knew he couldn't. To press a key now would feel like a trespass. This was her instrument, at least for tonight. Perhaps it always had been, in a way he never understood. He became aware of a quiet conversation nearby. Two of the older waitstaff were clearing a tray, their voices low. "Told me she's the new tuner," one murmured to the other. "From the valley. Comes in once a month. The hotel manager found her years ago. She fixes the old pianos in the village halls out there. Teaches the kids for apples and firewood, they say." "Tuner?" The other whispered back, impressed. "That wasn't tuning. That was something else." "But that's it, see," the first one said, with a wisdom that struck Anton to his core. "She listens. Really listens. To the instrument. Knows its voice inside out. Makes sense she could make it sing like that. A tuner. She didn't just play the piano. She listened to it. She knew its soul from the inside. Her music wasn't something she forced onto the instrument. It was a conversation she had with it. That was the connection he had never made. The connection his conservatory degrees had never mentioned. He had come here tonight to be a king. He was leaving as a beggar, empty-handed, but with a terrible, precious new knowledge burning a hole in his chest. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He walked out of the ballroom, the sounds of the revived party growing fainter behind him. The grand lobby was quiet. His footsteps echoed on the marble. The doorman nodded and fetched his coat. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp. It was a clean shock after the crowded, perfumed heat of the ballroom. He stood on the steps of the Grand Hotel, looking out at the city lights, the neat rows of street lamps, the orderly world he knew. But it wasn't orderly anymore. It was different. The night seemed bigger. The silence was full of potential music. He thought of his apartment, filled with his perfect scores and his silent, gleaming piano. It seemed like a museum now, a tomb for something that had never really lived. He thought of tomorrow's practice, of the upcoming concerts. The notes on the page looked, in his mind's eye, like dead things, like insects pinned to a board. He started walking, not toward his waiting car, but just walking, letting the cool air clear the numbness from his head. The duel was over. He had lost. But for the first time, losing didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a brutal, necessary beginning. He had been challenged, not by her, but by his own ignorance. And he had realized his error. Not a small error in judgment, but the foundational error of his entire life. He had confused technique with music. He had mistaken applause for understanding. Somewhere out in the dark beyond the city, in a valley, a woman in a simple dress was probably driving home. Her hands steady on the wheel, the music already just a private memory. She had given her gift and left, needing nothing from them. And he, the celebrated virtuoso, stood on a street corner with everything: fame, skill, money, and felt he had nothing at all worth having. But he had heard it. That was the thing. He had heard the real thing. And once you hear it, you can never unhear it. It becomes the measure for everything else. The memory of her music, of the way the piano spoke under her hands, would now haunt every note he ever played. It would be a ghost in his practice room, a critic more severe than any newspaper. It was a painful gift, the most painful he had ever received. But as he turned his collar up against the chill and began the long walk home, he knew, with a strange, quiet certainty, that it was the only gift from this whole glittering, empty world that had ever truly mattered. The duel was done. The lesson, however, had just begun.